controversial events in the Iraq War is the Blackwater-Fallujah ambush of 2004. The ambush was a turning point in the conflict, and it had a significant impact on the way the U.S. military conducted operations in Iraq. Before we get into the details of the ambush, let's first understand the context of the situation. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the United States launched a war on terror that included the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The U.S. military was tasked with securing the country and defeating insurgent groups, but the task proved to be challenging. As a result, the U.S. government turned to private military companies like Blackwater to provide security services in Iraq. These companies weren't subject to the same regulations as the U.S. military and were allowed to operate with a high degree of autonomy. Initially, the U.S. military faced little resistance, but as the occupation continued, opposition grew stronger and the insurgency began to take hold. By 2004, the insurgency had intensified, and the U.S. military was struggling to contain the violence and unrest in the country. Fallujah, in particular, was a hotbed of insurgency activity, and it had become a symbol of resistance against the U.S. occupation. Blackwater USA was a private military company that was contracted by the U.S. government to provide security for its personnel in Iraq. Blackwater had a reputation for being one of the most professional and efficient security companies in Iraq. However, it was also known for its aggressive tactics and its lack of accountability. Scott Helvenston was a former Navy SEAL who had served in several conflict zones, including Somalia and Kosovo. He'd also worked as a stuntman and had appeared in several movies, including G.I. Jane and The Rock. Jerry Zovko was a former Army Ranger who had served in the Gulf War and had worked for Blackwater for several years. He was known for his physical fitness and his dedication to his work. Wesley Badalona, also a former U.S. Army Ranger who also worked for Blackwater for several years, he was known for his calm demeanor and his ability to handle high-pressure situations. Michael Tigg was a former U.S. Army Special Forces soldier who had served in several conflict zones, including Bosnia and Afghanistan. He'd also worked as a private contractor for the U.S. government before joining Blackwater. All four contractors had extensive military experience. On March 31, 2004, a convoy of vehicles, including 2 flatbed trucks and 2 armored SUVs, was on its way to deliver food supplies to a U.S. military base in Fallujah. The convoy was being escorted by the 4 Blackwater contractors. Badalona and Zovko were in the front vehicle, followed by the flatbed trucks, followed by Helvenston and Tigg in the rear vehicle. As the convoy made its way through the city, it was ambushed by a large group of insurgents armed with rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and other weapons. The attackers had set up roadblocks and barricades along the convoy's route. The insurgents first approached the rear of the convoy, and they started shooting at the vehicles as they approached. From behind, from the sides, bullets spiral through the doors and shatter the windows. Helvenston and Tigg are shot dead first. Zovko and Badalona, 2 truck lengths ahead, hear the gunfire. Badalona hits the accelerator. He wants to drive straight, escape the kill zone. Standard procedure in an ambush, but the road's blocked up ahead. He turns hard to the left and does a U-turn into the eastbound lanes. They're under heavy fire now from behind and at close range. 2 rounds rip through the driver's seat, catching Badalona in his back. He slumps over onto Zovko, who has already been dead by then. The contractors tried to escape, but there was just too much resistance. Eventually, they got overwhelmed and brutally killed. Shortly after the firefight, the locals swarmed the vehicles, pouring out of alleys and shops and apartments. Badalona's carbine is yanked off his neck. A teenager in white trousers vaults the hood of the lead SUV, reaches through the passenger window, and grabs Zovko's gun, taking radios and everything they could find on the contractors. Dragged from their vehicles, their bodies were beaten and burned, with their charred corpses then dragged through the city streets before being hanged over a bridge crossing the Euphrates River. They'd stay up there for almost 10 hours before the Iraqi police cut them down. The ambush was also helped by corrupt Iraqi forces, luring the convoy into the planned ambush. The Fallujah ambush sparked a massive response from the U.S. military, and it led to the First Battle of Fallujah. The battle resulted in significant casualties on both sides and it was one of the bloodiest and most intense battles of the Iraq War. The operation, which began on April 4, 2004, involved more than 10,000 U.S. troops and was one of the largest military operations of the war. The battle was intense and brutal, with heavy fighting taking place in the streets and buildings of the city. The U.S. military used heavy firepower to try and dislodge the insurgents, including artillery, airstrikes, and tanks. The fighting resulted in the deaths of hundreds of insurgents and dozens of U.S. troops. While the Blackwater Fallujah ambush is widely known, there are many aspects of the story that are not commonly discussed. One of the most significant of these is the fact that the contractors weren't properly equipped or trained for the mission they were assigned. According to reports, the contractors were driving unarmored SUVs and weren't wearing body armor at the time of the ambush. They were also reportedly not provided with adequate intelligence or support from the U.S. military. Furthermore, the contractors weren't informed of the level of danger they would be facing in Fallujah. They were told that they would be providing security for food deliveries and weren't informed that they would be driving through a hostile area. For the family of Scott Helvenston, the grief was compounded by what they saw as a betrayal by Blackwater. They alleged that the company had failed to provide adequate security for the convoy and had put their son's life at risk. The family sued Blackwater for wrongful death, alleging that the company had breached its duty of care by failing to provide sufficient protection for its employees. The lawsuit was filed in 2005, and it was a long and difficult process for the family. Blackwater, on the other hand, denied any wrongdoing and argued that it had provided the necessary security for the convoy. The company also argued that it was immune from lawsuits under the doctrine of sovereign immunity, which protects government contractors from liability for actions taken on behalf of the government. It also highlighted the dangers of using private military contractors in war zones. Private military companies like Blackwater weren't accountable to the same standards as the U.S. military and are often motivated by profit rather than the safety of their employees. The Blackwater Fallujah ambush was a tragic event, no doubt, that had far-reaching consequences. This ambush serves as a reminder of the dangers of war and the sacrifices made by those who are sent into harm's way. It also highlights the importance of accountability, transparency, and proper training and equipment for those who are tasked with providing security in war zones.